Hello and welcome everybody to our Lift Every Voice book club. And our featured book for this month of August is I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness by Austin Channing Brown. And I'm delighted to be joined again by my wonderful co-host, Claudia Love Mair. And she's in Kentucky, I'm in Ireland, and we're going to have a good, I think, challenging conversation on this book. This book, yeah, really rich and really a lot of good food for thought. So we're excited to dive in. And I thought I would just begin, Claudia, by asking you, as a Black woman reading this book, what just kind of your overall impression of it and sort of what feeling it left you with, or any just kind of overall impressions before we dive into the specifics.
Okay. Out of all of the books that we have delved into in Lift Every Voice, I have related and I have, been encouraged and inspired, had questions, and so the whole thing has been great. This particular book felt prophetic to me.
Mm,
And it's not a contemplative kind of book,
yeah.
but I felt like it was prophetic in that it was so direct in shining a light on the things that Black people face on a regular basis. It was kind of searing. And I appreciated that
Yeah.
because I know that she um, inhabits a lot of white spaces where she is able to share these type of insights. And I don't think there are enough Austin Channing Browns able to do that or
Mm-hmm.
welcome to do that. So, so it was a relief to
Mm-hmm.
know that so many non-white or so many non-black readers would be reading this and getting these insights that are so vitally important, and they're hard things to
Mm-hmm.
hear.
Yeah.
But if we're going to have the type of world that we all want to embody, these things have to be said. So my impressions of everything that she said was familiar. Nothing in this
Mm-hmm.
entire book was a surprise. And I think that one thing that white people don't know is that we get this education from the start. Like
Yeah.
from the start, like when I was little, and I'm talking probably under 7, like a really young child. Um, we actually we had to understand that white people could be dangerous to
Yeah.
us. We lived in a community that's very segregated, and right next to our city was Dearborn, Michigan. And at this time, right now, Dearborn has a large Arab population. There are more um, Arab people in Dearborn, Michigan than in Lebanon right now.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was coming up, it was a white city. My brother worked at a hotel there, and he was regularly harassed catching the bus home. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and and it's really sad, but I mean, if you think I was born in 1964, my parents they lived through the Jim Crow era and the civil rights movement, and where Black people could still be lynched for looking at a white person the wrong way, or for the smallest offense, real or perceived, then we had to be taught
Mm-hmm.
that white people could be dangerous to you, and
Yeah.
maybe in the same way that we know of, a Black man walks on the elevator with the white woman and she clutches her purse. We
Mm-hmm.
got that opposite. We got that opposite education, and I think these things that she brought up are so important. And she did it, you know, with such transparency
Mm-hmm.
that it's hard to look away,
Yeah.
even if you want to look away. So, so I had I have a deep appreciation for this book being exactly where it is in our journey, because we've opened up people to more writers of color. But
Mm-hmm.
here is something very stark and very painful.
Mm-hmm.
And look at this.
Yeah.
And then we can begin to go on and to heal and to have conversations about how we'll all be better.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that, Claudia. I was struck too by the timing of the book, having already read a few books together that were perhaps more directly related to contemplative tradition and practice. And then this one I was reading with that eye, of course, because that's part of the purpose of this, but then so appreciating so many details and concrete examples of things that weren't necessarily surprising to me, but like so heartbreaking to hear that experience over and over and over again, and to realize, like, to recognize how, yeah, the burden that's being carried by so many. And then the challenge, which we'll talk about kind of later in the call and the recording, about how this does, maybe address contemplative practice, which I obviously think it does in pretty profound ways. But I want to start with there's a quote on page 37, and I love the way she also she talks about really difficult things, but she also talks about some of the things she loves about Black culture and being a Black girl and all of that. And I love those parts as well, because there's like such a tenderness there. And she says, that day I fell in love. I fell in love with the soaring voices and the songs that moved us to tears and then chased the blues away. I fell in love with peppermint dealing church mothers and hymn singing deacons. I fell in love with fiery preaching that moves so deep it would undergird you and push you to your feet to praise. I fell in love with a Jesus who saw the poor and sick and hurting, a Jesus who had bigger plans for me than keeping me a virgin, a Jesus who loved and reveled in our Blackness. I love that last part in particular. So I just wondered if you could share a bit about your own experience of the Black church, and your own image of Jesus, and how has that been a liberating thing for you?
Wow. Um, if I haven't made it clear, I grew up in a Black community, and the only church was the Black church. Um, so, I went to a couple of churches, uh, Black churches, and really the same kind of basic structures. But when I was 15 years old, I went to a church where my great grandmother was she was one of the church mothers. She had long since passed, but she was
Mm-hmm.
one of the church mothers there when she was alive. This was a Pentecostal church, and this is when I had my true conversion experience. I had
Mm-hmm.
gone to Sunday school, because I was only 15 as well, but I'd gone to Sunday school, this, that, and the other. But this particular day, I'd gone to church during a revival, and that is where I feel like I met Jesus in the most tangible way. Um, so what the Black church came to mean to me, it was like it was a place where we could truly be ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
where we could lay down all of the pressures of society, our disadvantages, economically disadvantages, educational disadvantages, institutional disadvantages. We could lay all of that down and come together, and we knew the same songs. And I heard a pastor once say that I know a God that I can feel. And that is the experience of the Black church. It's so visceral
Mm-hmm.
and so embodied, like, you know, somebody could, well, no old church mother can go, yes, yes, Lord, and somebody can just get up and just start a joyous dance that we call shouting, and
Mm-hmm.
so beautiful. And this is where we got to be the most African,
Yeah.
because all of these styles of worship hearken back into the ways that we worshiped when we were in Africa. It distinguishes us
Yeah.
from any other style of worship.
Mm-hmm.
And so it always reminds me as well of during slavery, the slaves would go off alone because, we had to worship one way when the white master was there. But in this other way, when we were alone, in the sanctuary among the trees, we could be ourselves. We didn't have our language anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we didn't have our culture anymore, but we still had that way
Yeah.
that was African, that was in us, that has never gone away.
Yeah.
So that's my experience of the
Yeah.
Black church. It's beautiful, it's safe, it is where we could completely be ourselves.
Yeah.
And at the end of the book, when she talks about the shooting in the church and then coming back and just not letting terror keep
Yeah.
us from what we have always known to strengthen and nourish us. I thought it was so beautiful. It brought tears to my eyes. It's so beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. It was when when you did that sort of embodied expression, of that like amen and hallelujah. And I was thinking about how much, just my experience of kind of Black churches and worship is there's so much joy and embodied expression. And I wonder, this isn't actually like one of the questions we're going to talk about, but it just makes me wonder about kind of trauma responses and how that embodied response might be one way that has helped, I mean, obviously has helped people who have been so oppressed to flourish and to still carry joy. And I think about how joyless so many white churches are, and yeah, it's just a striking contrast and like a really beautiful witness, I think, to what's possible.
Oh yeah, Black joy comes at a great cost.
Yeah.
Um, I'm so sorry. I have to.
So,
I think I was saying that joy comes at a really high cost
yeah.
because there's always an assault and an affront
Yeah.
that a microaggression, just a
Mm-hmm.
constant bombardment against us just because of the color of our skin and how um, this society has received us from the moment that we arrived in chains. So Black joy, comes at a great cost, but it's so vital to our survival. I
Yeah.
don't think we would not have made it here this long without it.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
great. That
I
is
believe that.
amazing grace.
Mm. Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful.
All right, a question for you. One of the first things that she writes about is her name, Austin. Do you have a story about your name? And do you think being Christine has helped, um, or not helped, or it
Mm-hmm.
completely neutral? And do you think that you know that do your parents have to consider race when they named you? Like, what if they, would you have been a Shaniqua?
It's a great question because when I was thinking about that, I thought, gosh, my parents, I'm sure didn't consider race, which is obviously part of the whole white supremacy thing is right there. It's that you don't really need to navigate the world in that way. Um, Yeah, I mean, the biggest hindrance that my name has been is just in terms of spelling. Valters is my maiden name, so my father's family name, and Paintner is my married name, and both of those get misspelled. Yeah, the story of my name is basically my parents. My father was Austrian, and there's an Austrian nickname for Christine, which is Crystal, Christl, and my husband's really the only person who calls me that still. My parents used to call me that when I was little, and yeah, so they liked the nickname, so they called me Christine. And then my father was very much into names, so he named me Christine Elizabeth Nicole Alexandra. So,
Wow.
yeah, and they all have stories, but I won't go on about all of them. But yeah, he was very much into. I would think Christine actually would have more of a story, just given how much he loved, the stories of people's names. So, but yeah, it's kind of sobering to think that there didn't have to be any kind of navigating or wondering or worrying about what to name me in that context. So it was, yeah. What about you, Claudia? What is there a story behind your name?
Well, the gist of it is that my mother wanted us all to have normal names. She did not,
Mm-hmm.
well, what she said were normal names. She didn't want us to have any difficulties navigating the world because
Yeah.
of a name that she felt like would burden us. So all nine of us, she intentionally named, there's a James and a Stephen and a Paul and Karen and Carlene and uh, Regina. Um, and she named my youngest brother Levon. We don't know what happened that year. But
Oh,
he does not appreciate that name. So she just named me after a friend, one of her friends.
yeah,
But
lovely.
yeah, but she was intentional. Now
Yeah.
me, all of my children have African names. And
Uh-huh.
my intention was, I mean, like people can't spell them, most people can't pronounce them, but I wanted to saddle them with a sense of deep culture.
Yeah.
So not just a name that is identifiable as African American, but as identifiable as African, so that
Mm-hmm.
there is no doubt that we are connected to our
Mm-hmm.
African ancestry. Now, I don't know if they appreciate that, but that was
Yeah.
my thought going in.
Yeah, that's lovely. A lovely story. Yeah, I can see the way parents might want to protect their children, but I think that also that cultural celebration is a really beautiful gift. Kind of connected to that, I wanted to ask you that I love this passage too, connected to the loving the Black church, this interlude about why I love being a Black girl. And she talks about being enlivened by stories of survival. Even though white folks tried to steal our histories, lives, labor, culture, origins, we recover the records. And she gives thanks to her grandmother, filled with stories of triumph over slavery, over lynching, over Jim Crow, because our dignity was too strong to crush. And then she goes on to say, I sit at the feet of my elders and listen to them honor our shared past. Um, yeah, I wondered if you wanted to share anything about what you love about being a Black girl, and do you have a sense of resonance with that connection to the ancestors and what they endured and the wisdom they left and all of that?
Oh yeah, I think the biggest influence of loving being a Black girl or a Black woman is that
Hmm.
I had the honor and the pleasure of knowing my great grandmother.
Hmm.
Um, she was the matriarch of our
Hmm.
family, and after her death, no one actually took her place. She
Hmm.
is still considered the matriarch of our family, and she had all of the stories of the women in our family, including her own mother, who was a slave, who was, the story, her name was Rachel, very, very dark skinned woman, how that she was covered with grease and stood up on the auction block to be auctioned
Hmm.
off as a slave. And So we were able to hear stories that were directly connected to slavery, um, and the stories were, so much a part of us. They kept us focused. They gave us a sense of where we came from,
Mm.
and they also gave us, you know, a vision of where we could go from the auction block and how we will move forward into the world and create better for
Mhm.
for me, and then for my children and for my grandchildren, and so on and so on. Um, but a lot of people have this idea that Black women don't trust each other. But my trusted best friends are Black women who, um, we celebrate each other, our beauty, our resiliency, um, how funny we are.
Mhm.
I think I think it's joyous to be a Black woman and to know what our bodies have held, and what our bodies have released and still are releasing. Our music, our Aretha Franklin's and Gladys Knight's, our poets like one that Austin Channing Brown mentioned, and Tazake Shange. And the book is for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is not enough. Our Audre Lordes and our Alice Walkers. Oh yeah, we are magical, not just but because of what we've suffered and endured,
Mhm.
but because of what we've done despite that.
Yeah.
So those are the things that I love about being a black woman,
Yeah.
a black girl.
That's beautiful. I think there's like a poem in there or a proclamation. I love it. I love it. Mm.
Okay, so tell me about your church experiences. Were the places that you worship primarily white spaces? And if so, what ways were people of color welcomed into your world?
Mm. Yeah, that's another great question. I'd say because I've always lived in mostly urban environments, that there has always been at least some diversity in the churches that I've attended, for which I'm grateful. When I lived in Seattle in particular, there was a one church that I loved called St. Mary's, and they had a gospel choir. So I did get a taste for a while of that joy that comes from that kind of sharing, and um, it was a pretty diverse congregation. So I wouldn't say that that was necessarily representative of always of my religious experiences, but certainly was one of the highlights. I think that's part of why I'm so drawn to this, this sense of like what that joy is about, and how that can lift people up and help people to heal. Uh, yeah, I mean, now I live in Ireland, and there is some diversity actually in Galway City, I do have to say. But I would say that most of the church experiences I've gone to here are fairly white spaces. Um, Although I would say that in general, I find the Irish people to be very welcoming. Now, of course, I certainly won't say there's no racism here, because there definitely is. And I just think it manifests itself differently than in the States. And obviously there's a different kind of history that goes on here. But I do find that in general, the culture here is very much about welcoming in others and the stranger. I think because the Irish people have that history of their own people who had to emigrate and were, who went to say New York and were, had signs that said no Irish need apply. So I think the Irish have a really strong affiliation with the Palestinian cause, I think, as well, because of that sense of like rejection and racism and oppression and the whole British colonialism. So it's interesting to live here in a what's a predominantly white culture, but to have a bit of a different perspective on it because of the history that this is a white community that has experienced its own oppression, and the famine, is very much a part of their DNA and their struggle and their trauma as well. So yeah, I would love to find another church like St. Mary's in Seattle, but at some point, maybe I will. When we lived in Vienna for a while, there was also a lovely church. It was a large Filipina community because a lot of Filipino people go there to enter the medical field, and that felt like a really lovely space. Because one time we lived in Woodland, California, and it was a huge parish. It was the only parish for this town. It was probably the smallest town I've ever lived in, and there was a very large Hispanic community, but they had their own services all in Spanish, and the white community had all their services in English, and there was very little interaction, and it always grieved me a lot. And yet there was resistance on both sides to integrating because the Spanish community wanted their own culture, their own language, which makes sense. So yeah, anyway, that's my kind of limited my limited experience with that. But yeah, sort of an interesting, yeah.
That's interesting. When I came to Lexington, and this I've been here for 12 years, um, we went. Oh, I moved here with Lisa Sampson and Will Sampson, and our goal was to live in an intentional Christian community.
Nice.
Um, Will and Lisa were a white family, so when my family came, we just kind of geared geared toward, we went to their church initially, and this was, like a very white, predominantly white. There were some other families, but it was a predominantly white church, and it was a great mass. But I did not quite feel like this was my home, like
Mm-hmm.
that this was my space. And
Yeah.
I have gone to churches because at some point I left the black church, and then I began to go to all of these non-denominational churches because I was trying to navigate my way around things that I thought were a little problematic and kind of open up my world. So I went to church in many predominantly white spaces. So when I got here, I said, well, I'm going to go visit St. Peter Claver, which was the Black Catholic church, only one in the city. I think there are only maybe three or four, maybe five Catholic churches in Lexington, and they are
Mm-hmm.
predominantly white spaces, except one where they have a Spanish mass. And
Mm-hmm.
um, so when I got to St. Peter Claver, maybe it was 3/4 black. About 6 years in, it's like about half and half,
Mm-hmm.
black, white. And now everybody comes to St. Peter Claver, and my priest speaks in Spanish. He's a black priest, and he's so dynamic. He like raps during his homilies. He's amazing. He's funny, youthful, and he has drawn so many different people to us just by the sheer force of who he is, and his openness and acceptance. Yeah, so now, we don't have a separate Spanish mass because he speaks Spanish during the mass,
Mm-hmm.
which is wonderful. We do have like I think it's a Swahili, uh,
Oh,
where
really?
where this, like, you know most of us, we don't speak Kiswahili or Kiswahili,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's called. But so that's pretty specific. But yeah, I really appreciate how we have what he calls an African charism, which means our expression is just like the black church, same song, same everything, but it's Catholic, which I
Mm-hmm.
thought was lovely anyway, because the black church seems to be the black church no matter what the denomination is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, that's fabulous. It sounds, yeah. It makes such a difference to have such a dynamic leader and someone who really models that kind of welcoming space. It's really beautiful. I think maybe we should talk about some of the more challenging aspects of this book as well. And I was going to ask you about, let's see, she talks about on page 106, um, she says, the truth is oftentimes people of color don't have the time, energy, or willpower to teach the white person enough to turn the conversation into a real debate. To do so would be a ton of work. And she's talking about how often in these meetings and so forth, that anytime she kind of challenges, any kind of racist behavior or whiteness or anything like that, that, she gets off, she'll either get pushback or she'll get, confession. She talks about, people come to her to confess all of their, sort of racist sins or slip ups. And so I was really just struck about this concept of emotional labor, which I think is something that we're just generally as a culture becoming more aware of. I think how women tend to carry the burden of that. And then in this whole conversation around racism, how white people expect Black people, especially I think Black women, to carry that burden. Is that part of your experience as well, that this demand of sort of your emotional labor? And
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. I mean, when stuff happens, like Ferguson,
Mhm.
when that happened, and um, really not just Ferguson. I think Ferguson, I think was even Ferguson wasn't surprising to me in the way that Charlottesville was, and Ferguson is when Michael Brown was murdered by the police, left his body out in the street, and the huge uprising behind that for anyone that doesn't know. But Charlottesville, same kind of thing. But then there was this backlash with these white men with their tiki torches and their blatant white supremacy that was kind of enabled by the
Mhm.
President of the United States, 45. Um, that was so absolutely shocking to me. And even last summer, with the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, so many people contacted me,
Mhm.
and myself and other Black people in America were experiencing deep grief and trauma as these things were playing out, you know, with these confessions or with, what should I do? How do I respond? And it was hard because we didn't have the bandwidth to tell
Yeah.
white people while we are traumatized and grieving. And George Floyd, the video of his death was being replayed
Yeah.
over and over and over. And what some of our scholars are calling trauma porn,
Mhm.
where you see the devastation of Black bodies on the internet, or on CNN. And it is it is a incredible. I don't even have words to what a burden that is for Black people to bear. And so, yeah, there are people who do that. There are
Mhm.
white people who teach white people this is how we should respond, and it shouldn't be our responsibility.
Mhm.
It shouldn't. Now, I am a very generous person, and so when people come to me, I generally am open and
Mhm.
accepting and loving in those situations. Even at my job, um, I I was signed on to celebrate Black writers, to bring Black writers in with those economic and educational disparities, and say, hey, you can take writing classes for free. How do we support you? But I also, by default, became the person who, if there was a microaggression that took place in the classroom, it was brought
Mhm.
to me. Or um, if something happened in the classroom that was offensive to a Black student and the white instructor did not know what to do, they would ask me what to do. And
Mhm.
so while I don't feel like it's my responsibility, on the other hand, I haven't said you need to Google that. And in fact, um, I have made contact with a trainer who specializes in how to deal with things like microaggressions. And by microaggressions, in case some of our listeners
Mm-hmm.
or viewers don't know, often a microaggression that I have gotten is that I'm so articulate, as if that would be a surprise, as if
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so the underlying thought is,
Assumption. Yeah.
oh, how could you be so articulate? So that's a microaggression, and a microaggression could be something like asking um, saying to an Asian person, "I bet you're good at math," or something
Mm-hmm.
like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but these things do come up, and and they are brought to me. But I will also say that during all of the uprisings last year, and I'm very vocal on Facebook about whatever is bothering me, and I will write about it. And a lot of my white friends, like more than a few, just brought me dinner. They said, I'm
Mm-hmm.
gonna do a DoorDash for you. I'm just,
Mm-hmm.
here's an Amazon gift certificate. Buy yourself something that'll make you feel good.
Right.
So I had these lovely gestures of people saying, I'm witnessing the
Mm-hmm.
pain that you are in because of this, and you know, I'm here. I'm here
Yeah.
to share with you. I'm here to take some of the load off of you today. So
Yeah.
that was really beautiful. But this is like a really big, messy thing. And as these things continue to happen, and now police brutality and deaths at the hands of the police have always happened. We've always known that it's happened. But because now there are videotapes,
Yeah.
everybody knows it's happening. But it's happened the entire time that we have been killed and abused at the hands of white power since we arrived here. So in chains, which I, I have to say, because we didn't arrive here like everyone else.
Yeah.
And so we've known this all along, but because it's so in your face over and over again, it's hella traumatic for us. And so yeah, we don't have the bandwidth, and there are all kind of anti-racist resources out there. So
Yeah.
the benefit is that we are living in a time where people are doing the work of being anti-racist, and being
Mm-hmm.
anti-racist is different from being not racist, because most
Mm-hmm.
people are going to say they're not racist, but being anti-racist is taking a whole different stance in which we are actively pushing back against racism.
Yeah.
So it's an active posture, whereas not racist is a passive posture.
Right. Right.
So there are resources I recommend to everyone. Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's like an encyclopedia of what has happened, and not just toward Black people.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like an encyclopedia of racism in America and how we can do something different. And I recommend it to anyone who wants to live as an anti racist.
Yeah, it's a fabulous resource. I know for myself, I've been trying to be really intentional about filling like my Facebook feed and my Instagram feed with voices, people of color, particularly a lot of Black women in particular, because there are so many who are, so generously posting, and I can get that information that I need, and I can read and I can reflect, and I don't have to demand, somebody teach me something. And so many of them have Patreon pages, so you can, if you're able to be able to even give a little bit of support in that direction, I think is such a necessary, a very tiny act of reparation in terms of that, extending back what has been stolen. So,
Yes,
yeah.
yes. let me see what I want to ask you. Um, so one question that I have here is, it's a little presumptuous, but are there ways in which you have encountered this idea, whether it's spoken or unspoken, that white is right, or closer to God, or holier, or chosen? You know, I see this even in Christian publishing, where there
Mhm.
are so many more white authors being published, being uplifted. Give me your thoughts on that. How do you see that there's this idea, spoken or unspoken, that white is right, that white is more trustworthy?
Yeah, I think the predominant way for me has been just through representation in art, the white Jesus and the white Mary in particular, and how I mean it's so dominant that there are so many Christians out there who actually believe that Jesus and Mary were white, which is absolutely absurd. And not to mention that they were living in the Middle East, you know, but that, yeah, I think until you suddenly wake up to seeing the images all around you. I mean, it must be like being a Black person in a predominantly white space, like you're so conscious of it, and then as a white person you're not so conscious until maybe you get to enter a space where the conditions are reversed. And I find when I'm in those situations, it's like incredibly refreshing and challenging, because it's like I've suddenly become so self-conscious about being the white person. um, so yeah, so I think art, because I'm such a lover of art, and I see your beautiful painting there behind you, such a lover of art, and really, really working towards exposing myself to cultivating, different exposures to different um, artistic representations. I think when I was in college, actually, I took a course on liberation theology, and it was we did a lot of work, particularly with Latin America, because that's where liberation theology kind of emerged from, and and we looked at a lot of art as well, and that was like the most profound class for me, because it just all of a sudden, I wasn't really brought up in a religious tradition, and I was at a Jesuit university, and for me, the kind of the white Jesus, even as a white person, didn't really excite me. But then here was this Jesus who was on the side of the poor and the oppressed, and who was the liberator. And here was a Mary who was fierce, and that Magnificat is like this song of justice. And it's like, how did we not, how did the churches not, it's like it takes such willful blindness to not see that, and to not, yeah, welcome that in. So anyway, I also just want to say about publishing, I want to actually give a little shout out to Broadleaf Books, because I've been really impressed lately. Loretta Coleman Brown, who we talked with, she's publishing with them a book on Howard Thurman. Therese Taylor Stinson is doing one on Harriet Tubman. I just talked with Valerie Brown, who's another Black woman writer, who's also writing a book about courage. So I'm very excited to see a publisher that is obviously very actively inviting in those diverse voices. So I think there's a big watershed, or big, change afoot, hopefully. Give us certainly a lot more books to talk about in the upcoming
Yeah,
months as well.
yeah.
So
It really is beautiful. I'm impressed with them as well.
um, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned Audre Lorde earlier, and she was actually loved, when I was in college, her book about the erotic, but that's not what I want to talk about, although I'm sure we could have a great conversation. But that is a creative force as well. But then Austin Channing Brown quotes her about creative anger as a creative force, and anger expressed and translated into action in the service of our vision and our future is a liberating and strengthening act of clarification. And I love that she brought in this creative anger, because I think my experience in churches is that anger is just something you don't, even though lament is such a rich part of our tradition, in most churches, there's in most white churches, I should say, there's no place for that expression. There's no room for that. And I think it has seriously stunted our emotional intelligence when it comes to our relationship to God. So what is your experience of creative anger? Is it come a little more naturally for you? Is it something that's cultivated or encouraged, or is it still challenging?
That's a good question. I don't know that I know that I have creative anger and maybe just anger, period, not necessarily creative. I don't like I don't walk through life as this, enraged person, and
Yeah.
maybe a part of that is because Black women are so often stereotyped as being
Mm-hmm.
angry Black women. Like last year, a lot was going on in America, and I had some thoughts, and I had some criticisms of 45, and and I expressed those criticisms very calmly, like anyone would, say, this is problematic.
Mm-hmm.
And I had usually white men come to me and you can't have this, I don't understand this blind rage. And it was like, that wasn't
Mm.
blind rage. That was a criticism.
Yeah.
And if a white male had said a criticism of that nature, he would not have been accused of having blind rage. So it's very much possible that I keep myself in check,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't want to be considered the angry Black woman. So I don't think I build my life around
Mm-hmm.
tiptoeing around that idea. I think that some of that is probably there, but I think I'm a person who I know I am a person who tries to embody love. And even anger, I feel, can be born of love. Anger
Mm-hmm.
can be born of love when you are outraged by how someone in the margins is being
Mm-hmm.
treated. So, because I have such um, an intentional posture of being a loving human and
Mm-hmm.
embodying love in as many ways as I can, being angry doesn't really bother me or scare me because I know it's coming from a place of love. What would scare or bother me is that if I had become bitter.
Mm-hmm.
And of course,
Yeah.
I have every right to be bitter, but I don't want to live in bitterness.
Yeah.
I don't find joy in
Yeah.
bitterness, and I want joy and I want love. And so, yeah, anger is definitely a driving force because I do take up for the underdog and for the
Mm-hmm.
people in the margins, and I do so very passionately, but it always comes from a place of love. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, I just want to follow up on that. Well, first of all, I'm just, of course, noticing your middle name is Love, and you've got your love pillow there. But one of the questions I wanted to kind of follow up on is, um, uh, Austin talks about, I need a love that is troubled by injustice. And I was thinking about how this, I think for me, this is where it ties back to this Christian contemplative tradition, that for me, the heart of contemplation and contemplative practice is dwelling in that sense of love that is the foundation of everything. And not to say that we don't have our times when we doubt that or when we feel far away from that, but I think ultimately that's like the Christian mystical tradition is about trusting that love is that foundation. And so I think her book, this love troubled by injustice, that to see, I think I'm so troubled by the whole kind of Christian right, very individualistic sort of narrative where it doesn't, there isn't a sense that their sense of what it means to love their neighbor doesn't extend to challenging injustices. Anyway, I just wondered what you thought about in terms of how, connecting this back to the contemplative tradition and how kind of love plays that role.
I think about people like Howard Thurman,
Hmm.
who was very, very powerful in his walk with Jesus and being such an amazing contemplative. And he didn't really, you know, get out there like some of his peers did. And of course,
Hmm.
criticized for that. There are going to be some of us that we do address these things in prayer, that
Hmm.
we do our warfare in prayer. Um, and then there are those of us who are going to take to the streets and we're going to march with Black Lives Matter. And I think it's just about knowing who you are and staying
Yeah.
in your lane. I don't think everybody has to go out and protest. I couldn't go protest last year. I was like a over 100 pounds overweight. My knees were bad, um, I told my daughter I was going to go to the protests. We had quite a few in Louisville because of Breonna Taylor, even in Lexington, and they were intense with you know uh, people getting tear gassed and rubber bullets right here in Kentucky. And my daughter said, "Mama, you can't even run.
Hmm.
Can't
Yeah.
run if something were to go down as clearly things are." So I couldn't. So what did I do? I wrote about it. I prayed about it. I had to stay in my lane. And of
Hmm.
course, my daughter, because I had pre-existing conditions, I was at very high risk
Yeah.
for COVID.
Hmm.
And my daughter said, "No, ma'am." My mother said, "I did not raise you to be stupid." And as much as my heart wanted to be out in the street protesting, my body was not the one that could be out there like that. And I know, I think about Dorothy Day as an old woman being out in those protests, and God bless her, but my mom and my daughter said, "No, ma'am, not you."
Yeah.
So we do have to be true to who we are and what we can do. But I think we should be intentional at the very least. This is a problem for all of us, and no one can hide from it.
Yeah.
So we need to do what we do in the way that we do it, with great love and great intention.
Yeah. I think that's really beautiful. And I think that's, yeah, again, the heart of what it means to be a contemplative is to really come to know yourself and your gifts and your limitations. And then out of love to respond to what's happening to the world in the world, and to see the places where, hatred is being wielded, and violence and destruction, and how do we resist that. And there are all different kinds of resistance, is what I hear you saying. And I know for myself, as someone with a chronic illness too, and that's I have to find my own ways of resisting that may come more through writing, or may come more through presence or prayer or advocacy for you know issues that I care about, and all of that. So
Even this book club, lift every voice is an act of resistance.
yeah, exactly. Thank you for lifting that up. Actually, we've been on the recording for close to an hour, so I think maybe we should kind of bring things to a close here. Just see if there's any last things you wanted to say about the book, or anything that you wanted to add. Uh,
No, no, and I do apologize. Life has been really crazy, but coming back in August, when we discuss this book, we can have a lot more interaction about
yeah,
these issues together as a community.
that sounds wonderful, Claudia. Thank you for that. I just want to close by just mentioning that Austin Channing Brown also talks about kind of living in the shadow of hope at the end of the book. And I loved that image, because it was, for me, about so much about faith, like continuing to act even though you don't know what the consequences will be or you don't know what the results will be. And so that seems to me like to be the heart of love and the heart of faith, which I think was a beautiful way to end the book. And just kind of the note I wanted to leave people with, that even when it seems overwhelming or impossible to unravel, like we're all called to take like a step or two steps or whatever we're capable of. Thank you, Claudia. It's always such a joy, a really true joy to have these conversations with you. I'm really grateful for all that you offer to our community and, yeah, to the world through your gifts.
Thank you. I love being here with you, truly, and with all of you.